The rise and fall of the British Empire. How a rain-soaked island conquered a quarter of the world. A small, rain-soaked island off the coast of continental Europe once controlled a quarter of the entire planet's land surface and ruled over more than 400 million people. The empire on which the sun never set did not begin with government armies or royal decree. It began with legally sanctioned pirates and a ruthless corporation whose own private mercenary army eventually grew larger than the entire British national military. For more than 3 centuries, the Royal Navy dominated 7 seas, toppled the Spanish Empire, crushed Napoleon's France, and forced China to its knees during the Opium Wars. And then the very 2 world wars Britain fought and won drained its treasury dry, forcing the empire to abandon the so-called jewel in the crown, India itself, and retreat back to its own small island. This is the complete and factual story of how the British Empire rose, how it ruled, and how it fell. England's first serious overseas ambitions were modest and largely unsuccessful. In 1583, Sir Humphrey Gilbert sailed to Newfoundland, off the coast of modern Canada, and formally claimed it as England's first overseas colonial territory. Gilbert himself drowned on the return voyage, and the settlement he founded failed to take root. But the claim itself marked the symbolic beginning of England's colonial ambitions. England in this period remained a comparatively poor and militarily modest kingdom, dwarfed by the wealth and naval power of Spain, whose American colonies shipped enormous quantities of silver and gold back to Europe each year. Queen Elizabeth I, unable to challenge Spain directly through open warfare, instead issued letters of marque authorizing English sea captains, most famously Sir Francis Drake, to legally plunder Spanish treasure ships as privateers, state-sanctioned piracy that allowed England to profit directly from Spanish wealth while maintaining a degree of official deniability. This calculated policy of state-sponsored piracy escalated tensions between the 2 kingdoms considerably, and in 1588, Spain launched the Armada, a massive invasion fleet intended to conquer England outright. The Spanish fleet, though vastly outnumbering English ships in tonnage and firepower, proved less maneuverable than the smaller, faster English vessels, and a combination of skillful English naval tactics and a violent Atlantic storm that scattered the retreating Spanish ships around the British Isles produced one of the most consequential naval defeats in European history. The destruction of the Armada fundamentally transformed English strategic thinking. English leaders concluded that their small island's future prosperity and security depended not on competing directly with continental land powers, but on mastering the sea itself, a strategic insight that would define English, and later British, foreign policy for the following 3.5 centuries, and that would ultimately produce the largest maritime empire the world has ever known. The specific naval tactics deployed against the Armada deserve closer attention, since they reflected a genuinely innovative approach to naval warfare that departed from the grappling and boarding tactics that had dominated Mediterranean naval combat for centuries. English commanders, including Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham, favoured using long-range cannon fire to damage enemy ships from a distance rather than closing for boarding action, exploiting the superior manoeuvrability and gunnery of the smaller English fleet against the larger but more cumbersome Spanish galleons. The decisive moment came when English fireships were sent into the anchored Spanish fleet at Calais, forcing the Armada to scatter in panic and abandon its tight defensive formation, a tactical masterstroke that set up the subsequent battle and the fleet's eventual catastrophic destruction by Atlantic storms as it attempted to sail home around the northern coast of Scotland and Ireland. Elizabeth I's own calculated approach to this entire period of maritime confrontation reveals a genuinely shrewd political mind. operating with limited resources against a vastly wealthier rival. Rather than committing scarce royal funds to build and maintain a large standing navy of her own, she instead licensed private investors and captains to fund their own privateering expeditions in exchange for a share of the plunder, effectively crowdsourcing England's early naval challenge to Spain while keeping royal financial exposure to an absolute minimum. This model of leveraging private capital and private initiative for what amounted to state military objectives would recur repeatedly throughout the following centuries of English and British imperial expansion, culminating eventually in chartered trading companies like the East India Company that would come to wield power rivaling that of nation-states themselves. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanently successful English colony in North America, following earlier failed attempts including the mysterious disappearance of the Roanoke colony decades earlier. Jamestown's early years were marked by severe hardship, starvation, and conflict with local indigenous populations, but the eventual cultivation of tobacco as a profitable export crop secured the colony's long-term economic viability. Far more immediately lucrative than North American tobacco, however, was sugar cultivation in the Caribbean. England seized islands including Barbados and Jamaica, converting them into intensive sugar plantation economies that generated wealth considerably exceeding what contemporary gold mining operations elsewhere in the Americas could produce. Sugar earned the nickname white gold for exactly this reason, becoming one of the most valuable commodities in the entire early modern global economy. This sugar economy depended entirely on enslaved labor. The Royal African Company, chartered specifically to manage England's participation in the transatlantic slave trade, transported an estimated 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic over the following century and a half, subjecting them to brutal conditions on Caribbean sugar plantations that produced some of the highest mortality rates of any forced labor system in recorded history. The Navigation Acts, a series of laws passed throughout the 17th century, required that all colonial trade be conducted exclusively through English ships and English ports, ensuring that the wealth generated by colonial commerce flowed directly back to enrich the English mercantile and shipping economy, rather than benefiting rival European trading partners or the colony's own independent economic development. During this same period, Jamaica in particular became a notorious haven for pirates, whom English colonial authorities frequently tolerated or even quietly encouraged, provided their raiding activities were directed primarily against Spanish and French shipping rather than English vessels, a pragmatic and cynical arrangement that allowed England to benefit from continued disruption of its imperial rivals' trade without directly bearing the diplomatic or military costs of open warfare. The brutal mechanics of the sugar plantation economy deserve fuller examination, since it represented one of the most economically significant and most morally catastrophic systems in the entire history of the British Empire. Sugar cultivation required intensive, backbreaking labor under conditions of extreme heat, and plantation owners calculated, with chilling economic precision, that it was often cheaper to work enslaved laborers to death and purchase replacements than to provide the food, rest, and medical care necessary to sustain a stable enslaved population through natural reproduction. This calculation produced mortality rates on Caribbean sugar plantations considerably higher than those documented on North American plantations, contributing to the staggering scale of the transatlantic slave trade required simply to sustain the labor force these colonies demanded. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar production flowed back into British society in ways that reshaped the entire domestic economy. Port cities, including Bristol, Liverpool, and London, grew enormously wealthy from their direct participation in the slave trade, and the broader triangular trade system connecting British manufactured goods, African captives, and American plantation commodities. This accumulated wealth financed the construction of grand civic buildings, funded early industrial investment, and enriched merchant families whose descendants would go on to hold considerable political influence throughout the following centuries, meaning that the profits of slavery became deeply and permanently embedded within the broader financial and industrial foundations of British economic development, a legacy that historians continue to trace and document in considerable detail today. The Navigation Acts, beyond their immediate commercial function of directing colonial trade through English ports, also represented an early and genuinely significant assertion of centralized parliamentary economic authority over the colonies, establishing a legal and administrative precedent for metropolitan control that colonial subjects would, within the following century, come to resent bitterly enough to fuel outright rebellion in North America. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, was one of the earliest joint stock corporations in world history, granted an official royal monopoly over English trade throughout Asia. Its founding purpose was straightforwardly commercial, to participate profitably in the lucrative spice trade that Dutch and Portuguese traders had already begun exploiting across the East Indies. After losing a costly commercial and occasionally violent struggle against the more established Dutch East India Company for control of the Indonesian spice trade, the English company redirected its attention toward the Indian subcontinent instead, establishing trading relationships to acquire cotton textiles, silk, and eventually tea, commodities that would prove, over the following century, to be considerably more lucrative and considerably more strategically significant than spices had ever been. To protect and expand these growing commercial interests, the company constructed fortified trading posts, known as factories, at Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, each gradually developing into substantial fortified settlements, complete with their own local administrative and military infrastructure. The company's military ambitions expanded dramatically as it began recruiting and training Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, into disciplined units under European-style command structures. At the height of its power, the company's private army numbered in the hundreds of thousands, at times considerably exceeding the entire standing military of the British government itself, an almost unimaginable concentration of independent armed force in the hands of a private commercial enterprise. By the middle of the 18th century, the East India Company had transformed from a purely commercial trading enterprise into something considerably more unusual and considerably more dangerous. A state within a state, possessing the practical capacity to wage war, negotiate treaties, mint its own currency, and collect taxes from millions of Indian subjects, all while remaining, at least in nominal legal terms, a private corporation, accountable to its own shareholders, rather than to any formal government authority. The specific corporate structure that allowed the company to accumulate such extraordinary and unprecedented power deserves careful examination. As a joint stock company, the East India Company raised capital from thousands of individual investors who purchased shares in the enterprise, sharing in its profits without bearing personal legal liability for its actions or debts beyond their initial investment, a genuinely revolutionary financial innovation for its era, and one that allowed the company to mobilize vastly greater financial resources than any individual merchant or even most contemporary monarchs could independently command. This structure meant that decisions with enormous consequences for millions of Indian subjects were ultimately made by a board of directors in London, answerable primarily to shareholders, concerned with dividend payments, a fundamentally commercial decision-making framework applied to what had effectively become the governance of an entire subcontinent. the recruitment and training of sepoy soldiers represented a particularly consequential company innovation, since it demonstrated that European-style military discipline, drill, and tactics could be successfully taught to non-European soldiers, producing forces capable of defeating considerably larger traditional Indian armies. Company military commanders discovered that disciplined volley fire, standardized drill, and reliable logistical support consistently outperformed the larger but less systematically organized forces fielded by many contemporary Indian rulers, a tactical and organizational advantage that the company would exploit relentlessly across its subsequent decades of territorial expansion throughout the subcontinent. The company's approach to local Indian rulers combined direct military conquest with a considerably more subtle strategy of political manipulation, playing rival Indian princes and kingdoms against one another, offering military support to favored local rulers in exchange for trading concessions and political influence, and gradually expanding its own direct territorial control through a combination of outright annexation and increasingly one-sided subsidiary alliance treaties that left nominally independent Indian states functioning, in practice, as company protectorates. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, is frequently described by historians as the first genuinely global conflict in human history, with Britain and France clashing not merely in continental Europe, but simultaneously across North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. In India specifically, the East India Company's ambitions collided directly with French colonial interests, and with local Indian rulers seeking to preserve their own independent authority. At the decisive Battle of Plassey in 1757, company forces under the command of Robert Clive defeated the considerably larger army of the Nawab of Bengal, achieving victory substantially through the calculated bribery of a key opposing commander who withheld his own troops from the actual fighting, combined with superior European artillery and disciplined infantry tactics. This victory delivered the company something of extraordinary and lasting economic value: the Diwani, the formal right to collect tax revenue directly from the roughly 20 million inhabitants of Bengal, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions of the entire Indian subcontinent. This single acquisition transformed the East India Company, almost overnight, from a profitable trading concern into one of the wealthiest and most powerful economic entities anywhere in the contemporary world. Britain's broader victory in the 7 Years' War proved equally decisive on other fronts, driving French forces entirely out of Canada and comprehensively establishing Britain as the dominant European colonial power across both North America and the Indian subcontinent. This sweeping military triumph, however, came at a severe and ultimately fateful financial cost. Britain emerged from the war carrying an enormous national debt, and the British government's subsequent attempts to recover these war costs by imposing new taxes on its American colonies would, within little more than a decade, ignite the very rebellion that would cost Britain its most valuable North American possessions entirely. The Battle of Plassey deserves particular attention as one of the genuinely pivotal moments in world history, since it established the specific pattern of conquest through calculated bribery, exploitation of internal political division, and superior organized firepower that the East India Company would repeat across the Indian subcontinent for the following century. Robert Clive's arrangement with Mir Jafar, a senior commander in the Nawab of Bengal's own army, to withhold his forces from the battle in exchange for being installed as the new, company-controlled ruler of Bengal afterward, established a template of corrupt collaboration between British commercial interests and compliant local elites that would recur repeatedly throughout the subsequent history of British colonial expansion in India and elsewhere. The global scope of the 7 Years' War extended well beyond India and North America into West Africa, where British and French forces competed for control of lucrative slave trading posts along the coast, and into the Caribbean, where both powers fought for control of valuable sugar-producing islands. This genuinely global pattern of conflict, fought simultaneously across multiple continents by the same two rival powers, led the historian Winston Churchill himself to later describe the 7 Years' War as the first true world war in history, a characterization that many modern historians continue to find persuasive, given the war's genuinely intercontinental scope and its lasting reshaping of the global balance of colonial power. The financial burden Britain assumed following this victory proved considerably more consequential than the territorial gains themselves. Britain's national debt roughly doubled over the course of the war, and the specific decision by Parliament to recoup these costs through direct taxation of the American colonies, rather than through increased taxation of domestic British subjects who had arguably benefited equally from the war's territorial gains, reflected a fundamental and ultimately catastrophic misjudgment of colonial American political sentiment and colonial Americans' own developing sense of their rights as British subjects. Facing the crushing weight of war debt accumulated during the 7 Years' War, the British government imposed a series of new taxes on its American colonies, including the Stamp Act, specifically intended to help recover these costs. Colonial Americans, who had no direct representation in the British Parliament that had imposed these taxes, responded with the now famous rallying cry of taxation without representation, and colonial anger escalated steadily through the following decade. What began as scattered colonial protest and boycott eventually erupted into open armed rebellion as American colonial militia forces took up arms against Britain's professional standing army, whose distinctive red uniforms earned British regular soldiers the enduring nickname Redcoats. Britain's traditional European rivals seized this opportunity with considerable enthusiasm. France, still smarting from its own humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War, along with Spain and the Dutch Republic, provided crucial military and financial support to the American rebellion, transforming what had begun as an internal colonial uprising into a broader and considerably more dangerous international conflict for Britain to manage. The decisive blow came at Yorktown in 1781, where British General Cornwallis found his forces surrounded by a combined American and French army, while a French naval fleet blockaded any possibility of evacuation or resupply by sea. Facing an impossible strategic position, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, effectively ending any realistic prospect of Britain reasserting military control over its rebellious American colonies. Remarkably, the loss of 13 American colonies did not, in fact, mark the beginning of British imperial decline, as many contemporary observers reasonably expected it might. Instead, Britain redirected its considerable colonial and strategic ambitions decisively toward Asia and the Pacific, beginning the construction of what historians generally refer to as Britain's Second Empire, a deliberate and remarkably successful strategic pivot that would, within a matter of decades, produce a territorial empire considerably larger and considerably more lucrative than the American colonies it had just lost. The scale of French, Spanish, and Dutch intervention on behalf of the American rebellion deserves closer examination, since it transformed what British commanders had initially hoped would be a relatively contained colonial policing action into an existentially threatening global war. French naval and land forces provided crucial military support, including the decisive naval blockade at Yorktown that prevented British evacuation or resupply. while Spain besieged British-controlled Gibraltar for years in a largely separate but simultaneously draining theatre of the broader conflict. Britain found itself fighting a war on multiple fronts across multiple continents against a coalition of its most significant European rivals, a strategic overextension that made ultimate American victory considerably more achievable than the rebellious colonies could likely have secured fighting Britain alone. The specific lessons British political and military leadership drew from the American defeat proved genuinely significant for the subsequent development of British colonial policy elsewhere in the empire. Rather than concluding that direct taxation of distant colonies without local representation was inherently unwise, British administrators instead concluded more narrowly that the specific combination of a colonial population culturally and politically similar enough to Britain itself to develop a genuine independent political identity, combined with insufficient direct British military presence to enforce continued compliance, had been the specific and avoidable failure. This lesson would shape British approaches to governing India and other subsequent colonial acquisitions, where direct military and administrative presence remained considerably more extensive and considerably more heavily enforced than had ever been the case in the more loosely governed American colonies. The financial and strategic pivot toward Asia that followed the American loss was neither immediate nor entirely deliberate, but rather emerged gradually as the East India Company's already substantial territorial holdings in India continued expanding through the final decades of the 18th century, increasingly absorbing British governmental attention, investment, and military resources that might otherwise have been directed toward attempting to reclaim or compensate for the lost American territories. In 1770, the naval explorer Captain James Cook charted the eastern coastline of Australia and New Zealand during his first Pacific voyage, formally claiming this newly mapped territory for the British Crown and opening an entirely new chapter of British colonial expansion into the Pacific region. The specific practical impetus for actually settling this remote and distant territory arrived from an unexpected direction. The loss of the American colonies had eliminated Britain's traditional practice of transporting convicted criminals across the Atlantic to serve their sentences as indentured laborers, and Britain's domestic prisons, deprived of this outlet, rapidly became dangerously and unsustainably overcrowded. In 1788, the First Fleet, comprising 11 ships carrying some 736 convicts, along with their guards and administrators, arrived at Botany Bay, establishing what would become the penal colony and eventual city of Sydney, a genuinely remarkable solution to a domestic prison overcrowding crisis that inadvertently launched an entirely new continental colonial venture. The arrival of British settlers proved catastrophic for Australia's Aboriginal population, who had inhabited the continent for more than 50,000 years prior to European contact. Introduced European diseases, to which Aboriginal populations possessed no prior immunity, killed enormous numbers of indigenous people, while British settlers systematically displaced Aboriginal communities from their traditional lands, often through direct and deliberate violence, in a prolonged and deeply tragic pattern of colonial dispossession and demographic catastrophe. By the 19th century, Australia had transformed considerably beyond its origins as a remote penal colony, developing into the world's largest wool-producing territory, its vast interior grazing lands supplying the raw material that fed Britain's rapidly industrializing textile manufacturing sector, a genuinely significant economic transformation that converted what had begun as a dumping ground for convicted criminals into one of the most economically valuable territories within the entire expanding British Empire. The transportation system that sent convicted criminals to Australia continued for several decades after the first fleet's initial arrival, eventually sending more than 160,000 convicts to Australian penal colonies before the practice was gradually phased out. The colony's demographic character shifted considerably over time as free settlers, attracted by the availability of land and the discovery of gold deposits in the 1850s, increasingly outnumbered the original convict population, and Australia gradually developed the institutions and infrastructure of a genuine settler society, rather than remaining merely a distant prison. The catastrophic demographic collapse of Australia's Aboriginal population deserves particular historical attention, since it represents one of the most severe instances of colonial demographic destruction anywhere in the British Empire. Estimates suggest Australia's Aboriginal population may have numbered somewhere between several hundred thousand and over 1 million people at the time of British colonisation, and this population was reduced by an estimated 90% or more within roughly a century of sustained European contact, through a devastating combination of introduced disease, violent conflict and massacre, forced displacement from traditional lands and food sources, and the systematic destruction of traditional social and economic structures. A demographic catastrophe whose full scope and moral weight Australian society continues to grapple with and formally acknowledge only in relatively recent decades. New Zealand's colonial experience, while sharing certain broad patterns with Australia, developed along a somewhat distinct trajectory, particularly through the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, an agreement between British colonial authorities and Maori chiefs that nominally established a framework for shared governance and land rights, though subsequent British interpretation and enforcement of the treaty's terms proved highly contested and frequently violated in practice, leading to a series of armed conflicts known as the New Zealand Wars during the following decades as British settlers and colonial authorities pressed for expanded control over Maori land. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered and dominated the great majority of continental Europe, and he assembled an invasion force of more than 100,000 soldiers specifically intended to cross the English Channel and conquer Britain itself. This invasion threat was decisively neutralized at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, where the British naval commander Lord Nelson employed an unconventional and genuinely audacious tactic, deliberately splitting his fleet to cut directly through the combined French and Spanish battle line, rather than engaging in the traditional parallel line of battle formation. The resulting engagement comprehensively destroyed the combined enemy fleet, though Nelson himself was fatally wounded by a French sniper during the height of the battle, dying just as news of his decisive victory reached him. Trafalgar secured British naval dominance so completely and so thoroughly that no serious naval challenge to Royal Navy supremacy would emerge again for an entire century, granting Britain essentially unchallenged control over the world's oceans and the global trade routes that depended upon them. Britain subsequently employed this overwhelming naval supremacy as a powerful economic weapon, imposing a comprehensive naval blockade against Napoleon's European ports, specifically designed to strangle French trade and starve the French economy of the resources it needed to sustain its continued war effort, an economic strategy that steadily and substantially undermined Napoleon's broader continental position, even as his armies continued winning victories on land. The Napoleonic Wars finally reached their conclusion at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where a combined British and Prussian army under the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher decisively and permanently defeated Napoleon's forces, ending his political career for good and leaving Britain standing, by a considerable margin, as the world's single dominant global power, a position of essentially unrivaled naval, commercial, and colonial supremacy that Britain would continue to hold for the following century. Nelson's specific tactical innovation at Trafalgar, sometimes referred to as the Nelson Touch, involved deliberately sacrificing the traditional formal advantages of the standard line of battle formation in favor of a bold, calculated risk. By splitting his fleet into two columns and driving directly through the enemy line at a perpendicular angle, Nelson exposed his own leading ships to devastating raking fire during their approach. But this aggressive tactic allowed his fleet to break the combined French and Spanish line into disorganized, isolated segments that could then be overwhelmed individually rather than facing the concentrated firepower of a unified enemy formation. This willingness to accept significant tactical risk in pursuit of decisive rather than merely incremental victory characterized Nelson's approach throughout his naval career and cemented his lasting reputation as one of history's most celebrated naval commanders. The economic dimension of Britain's ultimately successful strategy against Napoleon deserves careful attention alongside the more celebrated military engagements. Britain's naval blockade of continental Europe, combined with its own continued access to overseas colonial markets and resources that remained entirely beyond Napoleon's reach, allowed the British economy to continue functioning and even growing throughout the prolonged conflict. While Napoleon's own attempted counter-blockade, the continental system, which sought to prohibit European trade with Britain, ultimately proved unenforceable and inflicted more economic damage on France's own European allies and subject territories than it managed to inflict on Britain itself. The century of essentially unchallenged British naval supremacy that followed Trafalgar, often referred to by historians as Pax Britannica, allowed Britain to expand its colonial holdings and global commercial influence, with remarkably little serious military opposition from any rival European naval power, a strategic advantage that would prove absolutely foundational to the subsequent 19th century expansion of British imperial power across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. By 1857, tensions between the East India Company's colonial administration and its own Indian sepoy soldiers had reached a genuine breaking point, and the specific spark that finally ignited open rebellion was the introduction of a new rifle cartridge that soldiers were required to bite open before loading, combined with widespread rumors that the cartridges themselves had been greased with a mixture of pig and cow fat, a substance deeply and specifically offensive to Muslim and Hindu religious sensibilities, had been greased with a mixture of pig and cow fat, substance deeply and what began as scattered mutinies among individual sepoy regiments rapidly escalated into a widespread and genuinely violent uprising that spread across substantial portions of northern and central India. Rebel forces killed British civilians, including women and children, in several particularly notorious incidents, and British colonial forces responded with equally brutal and often indiscriminate reprisal violence directed against Indian villages and civilian populations suspected of supporting the rebellion. Among the more notoriously brutal methods of execution employed by British forces during the suppression of this rebellion was blowing captured rebels from cannons, a deliberately gruesome method of execution specifically intended to produce maximum psychological terror and to deny victims any conventional funeral rites according to their own religious traditions. The British government, having concluded that the East India Company's private administration had proven fundamentally unfit to manage a colonial possession of India's scale and strategic importance, formally dissolved the company's remaining governing authority in the rebellion's aftermath. Direct British Crown rule over India began in 1858, and in 1876, Queen Victoria was formally proclaimed Empress of India, establishing what would come to be called the British Raj, a period of direct imperial administration that would continue for the following 9 decades, transforming India from a corporate commercial holding into the single most prized and most strategically significant possession within the entire British imperial system. The underlying causes of the 1857 rebellion extended considerably beyond the specific and immediate grievance over the greased rifle cartridges, however genuinely inflammatory that particular issue proved to be. Decades of accumulated resentment over company annexation policies, including the controversial doctrine of lapse, which allowed the company to annex any princely state whose ruler died without a natural biological heir, had generated widespread anxiety and hostility among both Indian rulers and ordinary subjects who viewed continued company expansion as an existential threat to traditional Indian political and social structures. Economic grievances compounded this political resentment, as company taxation policies and the deliberate destruction of India's traditional textile manufacturing industry, undercut by cheaper machine-made British textiles, had inflicted genuine economic hardship on broad segments of the Indian population. The scale and brutality of British reprisals following the rebellion's suppression left a lasting and deeply bitter legacy throughout the remainder of the colonial period. Beyond the notorious executions by cannon, British forces conducted extensive punitive campaigns against villages and communities suspected of harboring rebel sympathies, and the death toll among Indian civilians during the suppression phase is generally estimated to have significantly exceeded the number of British and loyalist casualties inflicted during the rebellion itself, an asymmetry of violence that reflected the fundamentally unequal power relationship underlying the entire colonial system. The transition to direct crown rule brought certain administrative reforms intended to prevent a repeat of the 1857 uprising, including increased British military presence, deliberate policies designed to prevent unified political action across India's diverse religious and ethnic communities, and somewhat greater, though still severely limited, incorporation of Indian elites into lower levels of colonial administration. These reforms, whatever their intended stabilizing effect, did not address the underlying structural inequalities of colonial rule and the seeds of the independence movement that would eventually end British rule in India entirely were, in a genuine sense, already being sown during this very period of the Raj's initial consolidation. By the early 19th century, Britain faced a genuinely serious trade imbalance with China. British consumers had developed an enormous appetite for Chinese tea, but China's own imperial government showed little corresponding interest in British manufactured goods, insisting on payment for tea exports exclusively in silver, a persistent drain on British bullion reserves that grew increasingly unsustainable over time. To reverse this damaging trade imbalance, the East India Company began systematically smuggling opium cultivated in British-controlled India into China, deliberately creating and then exploiting a growing population of Chinese opium addicts to generate the silver revenue that legitimate trade alone had failed to provide, a calculated and cynical policy of state-sponsored drug trafficking on an almost unimaginable scale. When Chinese imperial authorities moved decisively to confiscate and publicly destroy enormous stockpiles of British opium in an effort to halt this destructive trade, Britain responded not with diplomatic negotiation, but with direct military force, dispatching modern steam-powered ironclad warships that comprehensively outmatched China's considerably more antiquated naval defenses in the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842. The resulting Treaty of Nanking imposed deeply unequal terms on the defeated Chinese government, forcing China to pay substantial war reparations, open 5 treaty ports to British trade, and formally cede the territory of Hong Kong to British control. A second Opium War followed subsequently, during which combined British and French forces marched on the Chinese capital and deliberately looted and burned the magnificent Summer Palace complex. A calculated act of destruction specifically intended to demonstrate overwhelming Western military superiority and to compel China's continued and expanded compliance with the legalized opium trade, one of the more morally indefensible chapters in the entire history of British imperial commerce, built explicitly on the deliberate and profitable exploitation of mass drug addiction. The specific scale of opium addiction that British trade policy deliberately cultivated within China reached genuinely staggering proportions by the mid-19th century, with contemporary estimates suggesting that millions of Chinese subjects had become dependent on the drug, producing widespread social and economic disruption that Chinese imperial officials repeatedly and urgently sought to address through prohibition efforts that British commercial and military interests just as repeatedly and forcefully overrode. Commissioner Lin Zexu, the Chinese official whose destruction of confiscated British opium stockpiles in 1839 directly precipitated the First Opium War, had written a formal letter to Queen Victoria, personally appealing to what he characterized as basic principles of morality and international justice, asking how Britain could justify selling a substance so destructive to Chinese society when opium sale and consumption remained illegal within Britain's own domestic borders. A letter that, by most historical accounts, never received any formal response from the British government. The broader concept of gunboat diplomacy, which the Opium Wars exemplified so starkly, became a defining feature of British and, eventually, broader Western imperial engagement with East Asia throughout the remainder of the 19th century. The demonstrated technological gap between modern Western steam-powered ironclad warships and the considerably more traditional naval forces available to China and other regional powers meant that Western nations could reliably compel favorable trade concessions and territorial cessions through the mere credible threat of naval bombardment, without necessarily requiring the kind of sustained and costly land campaigns that earlier eras of colonial expansion had typically demanded. The treaty port system that emerged from the Opium Wars, under which China was forced to open numerous coastal and river cities to foreign trade and residents, under terms that granted foreign nationals extraterritorial legal immunity from Chinese law, established a pattern of what Chinese historians and political leaders would come to call the Century of Humiliation, a period of sustained foreign economic and territorial encroachment that continues to shape Chinese national historical memory and contemporary foreign policy attitudes to the present day. The discovery of enormous diamond and gold deposits in southern Africa during the latter decades of the 19th century dramatically intensified European colonial interest in the African continent, transforming what had previously been comparatively limited coastal trading interests into an aggressive and often violent competition for direct territorial control. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, the major European powers convened to formally divide the African continent among themselves, drawing colonial boundaries with essentially no regard whatsoever for existing indigenous ethnic, linguistic, or political territories, an act of purely self-interested cartographic convenience whose consequences continue to generate serious ethnic and political conflict across the African continent to the present day. British colonial expansion into Africa was substantially aided by a devastating new military technology, the Maxim gun, an early fully automatic weapon capable of firing some 600 rounds per minute, which allowed comparatively small British colonial military detachments to inflict catastrophic and wildly disproportionate casualties on far larger indigenous African military forces, armed with considerably more primitive weaponry. The diamond magnate Cecil Rhodes epitomized the era's expansive and often ruthlessly self-serving imperial ambition, dreaming of a continuous British-controlled railway line stretching from Cape Town in the south all the way to Cairo in the north, a vision of comprehensive British domination over the entire length of the African continent. British forces fought a series of brutal colonial wars during this period, including the Anglo-Zulu War, which ultimately destroyed the powerful Zulu kingdom, and the Boer Wars against descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa, during which British forces pioneered the systematic use of concentration camps to detain Boer civilians, including large numbers of women and children, in conditions of severe deprivation that resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths from disease and malnutrition, representing one of the earliest documented uses of civilian internment camps in the entire history of modern warfare. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 produced one of the more genuinely shocking military reversals of the entire colonial era at the Battle of Isandlwana, where a substantial British colonial force was comprehensively defeated by Zulu warriors armed primarily with traditional weapons, inflicting one of the most severe defeats a modern European army suffered against indigenous African forces during the entire period of colonial expansion. Britain responded to this humiliation with an intensified military campaign that ultimately succeeded in destroying the Zulu kingdom's independent military and political power within the same year, illustrating the broader pattern of the era. Individual colonial military setbacks, however severe, rarely proved sufficient to halt the underlying momentum of European technological and industrial advantage over the medium term. The Boer War concentration camp system, established by British forces under Lord Kitchener, specifically to deny Boer guerrilla fighters, continued support from their own civilian communities, ultimately interned more than 100,000 Boer civilians, along with a considerable number of black African civilians as well, and documented mortality rates within these camps, driven by severe overcrowding, inadequate food rations, and poor sanitation, claimed tens of thousands of lives, disproportionately among children. The public exposure of these camp conditions by British social reformer Emily Hobhouse generated genuine domestic political controversy within Britain itself, demonstrating that even at the height of imperial confidence, British colonial policy was not immune to at least some degree of internal moral scrutiny and public accountability. The overall pattern of technological asymmetry that characterized the scramble for Africa reflected broader disparities in industrial development between European powers and African societies during this specific historical period. Disparities that were neither permanent nor inevitable, but that proved, at this particular historical moment, sufficient to allow comparatively small European military forces to conquer and control vast African territories and populations, reshaping the political map of an entire continent within the span of scarcely more than 2 decades. Britain systematically secured and fortified control over the world's most strategically vital maritime choke points, including Gibraltar, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, Singapore controlling access to the South China Sea, and Aden, guarding the entrance to the Red Sea, a comprehensive global network of naval bases and fortified ports that allowed British naval and commercial power to project itself effectively into virtually every corner of the globe. The All-Red Line, an extensive network of undersea telegraph cables connecting Britain to its colonies across the globe, allowed the imperial government in London to communicate with military commanders in India, or Australia within a matter of hours, rather than the weeks or months that sailing ships had previously required, a genuinely revolutionary advance in imperial command and control capability. London itself became the undisputed financial capital of the entire world during this period, with the British pound sterling functioning as the primary global reserve currency, and London's banking and insurance institutions financing an enormous proportion of international trade and infrastructure investment across the globe. British naval policy during this period was formally governed by what became known as the two-power standard, a deliberate strategic doctrine requiring the Royal Navy to maintain a fleet larger than the combined naval strength of the next two largest naval powers in the world combined. An extraordinarily ambitious and extraordinarily expensive military policy that nonetheless successfully guaranteed unchallenged British naval supremacy for decades. By 1913, at the very height of its territorial extent, the British Empire controlled more than 35 million square kilometers of territory and governed a population of some 412 million people, making it, by any reasonable historical measure, the largest empire the world has ever known, a genuinely staggering scale of global dominion that, remarkably, was about to face its first truly serious and ultimately fatal challenge. The infrastructure of empire that Britain constructed during this peak period extended well beyond purely military and naval installations into a genuinely comprehensive global administrative and commercial system. The Indian Civil Service, staffed by a comparatively small number of British administrators overseeing hundreds of millions of Indian subjects, developed sophisticated bureaucratic systems for tax collection, legal administration, and infrastructure development that, whatever their fundamentally extractive colonial purpose, left behind lasting administrative and legal institutions that independent India would substantially retain and adapt following independence. Railway networks constructed across India, Africa, and other colonial territories, while designed primarily to facilitate the extraction and export of raw materials rather than to serve the developmental needs of colonized populations, nonetheless represented substantial and genuinely impressive engineering achievements that reshaped transportation and economic activity across vast territories. The cultural and ideological apparatus supporting this global empire proved equally significant to its material infrastructure. British educational institutions, both within Britain itself and increasingly across the colonies, cultivated an entire generation of colonial administrators steeped in a worldview that combined genuine technical competence with deeply embedded assumptions of racial and civilizational superiority, providing the intellectual and psychological justification that allowed a comparatively small number of British administrators and soldiers to govern hundreds of millions of colonial subjects with a considerable degree of internal confidence in the legitimacy of their own authority. The financial architecture underpinning Pax Britannica proved just as consequential as its military and administrative dimensions. British overseas investment reached enormous proportions by the early 20th century, with British capital financing railways, mines, and infrastructure projects not only within the formal empire, but across large portions of Latin America, the United States, and other regions entirely outside direct British political control. An informal economic empire that extended British commercial influence considerably beyond the territories actually coloured red. Growing German industrial and military ambition, particularly Germany's determined effort to construct a modern battleship fleet, generated intense and increasingly dangerous naval competition with Britain during the years immediately preceding 1914, contributing substantially to the broader web of alliances and tensions that would ultimately erupt into the First World War. Britain drew heavily on its vast colonial resources to sustain the resulting war effort, mobilizing more than 2.5 million soldiers from India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to fight and die on European battlefields far from their own homelands, a massive colonial contribution of manpower that Britain's own domestic population alone could never have sustained. Among the war's most notorious and most costly failures for British forces was the Gallipoli campaign of 1915, a naval and amphibious assault against Ottoman Turkish forces, conceived substantially by Winston Churchill, which ended in catastrophic and humiliating defeat, inflicting devastating casualties on Australian and New Zealand troops in particular, an experience that would leave a lasting and deeply significant mark on both nations' developing sense of independent national identity. In the war's aftermath, Britain and France secretly negotiated the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing the defeated Ottoman Empire's Middle Eastern territories between themselves, with Britain claiming administrative control over Iraq and Palestine, colonial boundary decisions whose consequences would continue generating serious regional conflict for the remainder of the 20th century and well into the 21st. Although Britain emerged from the First World War as one of the formerly victorious powers, gaining additional territory through the post-war settlement, the underlying financial cost of the conflict proved genuinely ruinous. Britain's national economy was severely damaged, and the country emerged from the war as the largest single debtor to the United States, marking an unmistakable and historically significant early sign that genuine global economic and financial leadership was beginning its long-term shift away from London and toward Washington. The human cost of Britain's First World War participation extended across every corner of the empire in ways that fundamentally reshaped colonial populations' relationship with imperial authority. Nearly 1 million British and imperial soldiers died in the conflict, and the disproportionate sacrifice demanded of colonial troops deployed to fight and die in a European conflict with limited direct relevance to their own homelands generated growing resentment and a strengthened sense of independent national identity, particularly among Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand troops, whose wartime contributions and sacrifices were increasingly seen within their own home countries as evidence that these dominions deserved greater independent recognition and authority within any continued imperial framework. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and the broader post-war partition of the former Ottoman Empire's Middle Eastern territories established colonial boundaries and political arrangements whose consequences would prove genuinely and lastingly destabilizing. Britain's simultaneous and fundamentally contradictory wartime promises, including commitments to Arab nationalist leaders regarding post-war independence and the separate 1917 Balfour Declaration expressing support for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, created a legacy of conflicting territorial claims and unresolved political tensions that would erupt into open and sustained conflict for decades following Britain's eventual withdrawal from the region. The financial reckoning Britain faced following the war extended well beyond simple debt accumulation to encompass a broader and more fundamental restructuring of the global economic order. The gold standard system that had underpinned pre-war British financial dominance proved increasingly difficult to sustain in the post-war economic environment, and Britain's eventual return to the gold standard at pre-war exchange rates in 1925 is generally regarded by economic historians as a significant policy error that further constrained British economic growth and compoundedness throughout the following decade, compounding the broader structural challenges the empire already faced in maintaining its pre-war global economic position. During the interwar period, New York's Wall Street decisively displaced London as the world's primary center of international finance and capital investment, a significant and largely irreversible shift that reflected Britain's genuinely weakened post-war economic position relative to the rapidly growing American economy. Ireland, situated closer to the British imperial heartland than any other colonial territory, fought a determined and ultimately successful war of independence between 1919 and 1921, achieving formal independence and demonstrating with unmistakable clarity that the British Empire could indeed be successfully challenged and fractured from within, even by a comparatively small neighboring territory. In India, Mahatma Gandhi pioneered a strategy of organized non-violent resistance, including sustained boycotts of British-manufactured goods and the symbolically powerful Salt March protesting British taxation and monopoly control over salt production, campaigns that steadily and effectively undermined the economic and moral legitimacy of continued British colonial rule. The Statute of Westminster, passed in 1931, formally granted full legislative independence to Britain's predominantly white-settled dominions, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, a calculated concession specifically intended to preserve their continued voluntary association within the broader British imperial framework rather than risk their outright departure. By the close of this interwar period, British political and military leadership had become increasingly and privately aware that the empire simply no longer possessed the financial resources or the available military manpower necessary to suppress every nationalist independence movement emerging simultaneously across its vast global territorial holdings, a quiet but genuinely significant erosion of imperial confidence that the coming Second World War would only accelerate dramatically further. Gandhi's specific strategic genius deserves closer examination, since his approach to anti-colonial resistance proved genuinely innovative and remains studied by political movements worldwide to the present day. Rather than pursuing armed insurrection, which would have played directly into British colonial military strengths, Gandhi instead cultivated a strategy of mass civil disobedience, specifically designed to make continued colonial administration prohibitively expensive and morally untenable, while carefully avoiding the kind of violent confrontation that would have justified severe British military repression in the eyes of international and domestic British public opinion. The 1930 Salt March, in which Gandhi led a symbolic and highly publicized walk to the sea, specifically to produce salt, in direct defiance of the British salt monopoly and associated tax, generated enormous international press coverage and demonstrated with particular clarity the corrosive economic and moral costs that British colonial administration was increasingly incurring simply to maintain its authority. The Irish War of Independence established a genuinely significant precedent that would influence subsequent anti-colonial movements throughout the empire, demonstrating that a determined guerrilla resistance movement, combined with effective international propaganda and diplomatic appeals, could successfully compel British political leadership to negotiate a genuine transfer of political authority, even from territory considered strategically vital and geographically proximate to the British imperial centre itself. The subsequent partition of Ireland, creating a separate Northern Ireland that remained within the United Kingdom, established another troubling precedent of colonial boundary drawing along contested sectarian lines that would generate decades of subsequent violent conflict. Economic historians studying this interwar period have identified the Great Depression of the 1930s as a further significant accelerant of imperial strain, as global trade contracted sharply and colonial territories increasingly sought greater economic autonomy and protection for their own developing domestic industries rather than continuing to serve primarily as captive markets for British manufactured goods and captive suppliers of raw materials, an economic relationship that had long formed one of the empire's most fundamental underlying commercial logics, and that the Depression's severe global economic contraction increasingly called into question, even among previously loyal Dominion governments. Following the catastrophic fall of France in 1940, Britain stood entirely alone among the major European powers in continued military resistance against Nazi Germany, enduring sustained and devastating nightly aerial bombardment of London and other major cities during what became known as the Blitz. To help finance this increasingly desperate war effort, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was compelled to transfer numerous strategically valuable British naval bases to the United States in exchange for essential military supplies and equipment under the Lend-Lease arrangement, a transaction that, while militarily necessary for Britain's continued survival, also represented a genuinely significant and symbolically telling transfer of practical strategic advantage toward the United States. The fall of Singapore in 1942 to invading Japanese forces represented one of the single most humiliating military defeats in the entire history of the British Empire, with more than 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops killed or captured in the collapse of what had previously been considered Britain's most formidable and most impregnable fortress in Asia, a devastating blow that permanently shattered the carefully cultivated myth of inherent European racial and military superiority that had underpinned so much of British colonial rule across Asia. In 1943, wartime policy decisions made under Churchill's government, which prioritized diverting available food supplies away from India toward European military and civilian needs, contributed substantially to the devastating Bengal famine, which killed an estimated 3 million Indian civilians through starvation, a catastrophic humanitarian disaster whose direct connection to specific British wartime policy choices remains a matter of serious and continuing historical controversy. Although Britain ultimately emerged from the Second World War as one of the war's formal victorious powers, the underlying reality proved considerably more sobering. The country's economy lay in genuine ruins. Its national debt had reached staggering and historically unprecedented levels, and genuine global superpower status had now decisively and permanently passed to the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain had won the war, but in every practical and financial sense, it had unmistakably lost the peace that followed. The fall of Singapore carried consequences that extended well beyond the immediate military and strategic humiliation Britain suffered in early 1942. Winston Churchill himself described the surrender as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history, and the psychological impact across British colonial territories throughout Asia proved genuinely profound and lasting. Populations across British Malaya, Burma, and India, who had been taught for generations to regard European colonial rule as an essentially permanent and unchallengeable feature of the political order, now had direct and undeniable evidence that European colonial powers could be decisively defeated by a non-European military force, a psychological and political rupture that historians generally regard as having significantly accelerated the pace of subsequent decolonization movements. The Bengal famine of 1943 remains one of the most morally contested episodes of Churchill's wartime leadership, with the specific question of direct governmental culpability continuing to generate serious historical debate. Wartime policies, including the diversion of shipping and food resources toward European theaters, the deliberate destruction of rice stocks and boats in coastal Bengal as a defensive measure against feared Japanese invasion, and documented instances of Churchill's own dismissive and racially charged comments regarding Indian famine relief requests, collectively suggest that specific and avoidable British wartime policy decisions substantially worsened and may have directly caused a humanitarian catastrophe that claimed millions of Indian lives, a devastating historical episode that stands in genuinely troubling contrast to Britain's simultaneous self-presentation as a nation fighting a righteous war against fascist tyranny and racial persecution in Europe. The financial mechanisms through which Britain funded its wartime survival, including the Lend-Lease arrangement with the United States and the accumulation of substantial wartime debts to India and other colonial territories in the form of sterling balances, left post-war Britain in a genuinely precarious financial position, dependent on American loans and facing mounting colonial demands for the repayment of wartime debts, precisely at the moment when Britain's capacity to generate the revenue necessary to satisfy these obligations had been most severely and comprehensively damaged. In 1947, no longer able to afford the financial and military costs of maintaining direct colonial control, Britain granted India its independence. But the hurried and poorly managed process of partition, dividing the subcontinent into separate India and Pakistan, triggered catastrophic sectarian violence that killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people and displaced tens of millions more in one of the largest and most traumatic mass migrations in recorded human history. Britain's own domestic population, meanwhile, faced genuine and sustained post-war hardship, with strict food rationing continuing for years after the war's official conclusion, a stark and humbling domestic reality for a nation that had so recently ruled over the largest empire the world had ever known. The Suez Crisis of 1956 delivered a final, unmistakable, and deeply humiliating confirmation of Britain's diminished global standing. When Britain and France launched a joint military intervention to seize control of the Suez Canal from Egypt, both the United States and the Soviet Union pressured them into an immediate and humiliating withdrawal, a moment widely regarded by historians as marking the definitive and unambiguous end of Britain's status as a genuine, independent global superpower. In 1960, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered his famous Wind of Change speech, formally acknowledging that Britain would rapidly grant independence to its remaining African colonial territories rather than continuing to fight an increasingly costly and increasingly untenable series of colonial wars against determined nationalist independence movements. By 1968, Britain had announced the complete withdrawal of its military forces from territories east of Suez, acknowledging plainly that it could no longer afford to maintain the extensive network of overseas military bases that had once projected British power across the entire globe. The Falklands War of 1982, a successful military campaign to defend the British-controlled Falkland Islands against invasion by Argentina, represented something of a final, brief flash of traditional British military assertiveness, though on a scale utterly incomparable to the empire's former global reach and dominance. Finally, on July 1, 1997, Britain formally handed sovereignty over Hong Kong back to China, an event widely regarded around the world as marking the symbolic and definitive close of the British imperial story. As the Union Jack was lowered for the final time in pouring rain over Hong Kong harbour, the empire on which the sun had once famously never set had, at last, come to its quiet and permanent end. What remained afterward was the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of 56 countries, most of them former British colonial territories, connected now by shared history, language, and legal tradition, rather than by any remaining imperial authority or obligation. The English language, the common law legal tradition, and parliamentary democratic institutions remain among the empire's most significant and most enduring global legacies, embedded permanently within the political and cultural fabric of dozens of independent nations across every inhabited continent. Yet the empire's darker legacies persist as well. The artificial and often deeply arbitrary colonial borders Britain drew across Africa and the Middle East, including the deeply contested territory of Palestine, continue to generate serious conflict and instability to this very day, a permanent and unresolved reminder that the consequences of empire, for better and for considerably worse, continue to shape the modern world long after the empire itself has passed into history. The specific mechanics of Indian partition deserve closer examination as one of the most consequential and most tragically mismanaged episodes of the entire decolonization process. The boundary lines separating India and the new state of Pakistan were drawn by a British civil servant, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never previously visited India and was given only a matter of weeks to complete his task, working from outdated maps and incomplete demographic data. The resulting boundaries split communities, religious populations, and even individual families across a newly drawn international border, with little regard for the practical human consequences, triggering some of the largest and most violent mass population movements in recorded history, as millions of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs fled across the new border in either direction, with communal violence claiming an estimated 1 to 2 million lives during the chaotic months surrounding independence. The broader pattern of British decolonization across Africa during the 1960s, while generally proceeding with less immediate large-scale violence than the Indian subcontinent had experienced, nonetheless frequently left behind fragile political institutions, arbitrary colonial-era borders that group together historically rival ethnic and linguistic communities within single new nation-states, and economic structures still fundamentally oriented toward the export of raw materials to former colonial markets, rather than genuine balanced domestic economic development, structural legacies that numerous African nations have continued grappling with well into the 21st century. The Falklands War of 1982 offers a genuinely instructive final case study in the empire's diminished but not entirely extinguished capacity for military assertion. Though militarily successful in defending British sovereignty over the islands against Argentine invasion, the campaign required Britain to draw on a substantially smaller and considerably more limited naval and military capacity than the empire had once commanded as a matter of routine, a scale of military effort that, while sufficient for this particular limited conflict, would have been entirely inadequate to sustain anything resembling the empire's former global military and territorial commitments.